Well, welcome to question 61 of the Secunda Secundae. This topic is the parts of justice, and I am Dr. Thibault. The parts of justice are fairly simple. There's two parts of justice, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, and those are the commutative and the distributive. Commutative forms of justice are one to another, maybe most easily understood as between two people or between individuals, particularly between equals within society. It is the justice you owe as an individual to your neighbor who is also an individual. Now, distributive justice is a little bit different. It focuses on how the whole relates to the parts. So often when we think about distributive theories of justice, we consider the question of the government. That's the biggest one. So how do we pay taxes and how do we gain benefits from paying taxes? All of these questions about who gets the benefits and who gets the burdens as part of distributive theories of justice. But also, Aquinas points out that family is also associated with this as well. So, who has what role within the family would be a question of distributive justice too. So, controversially within the story of the prodigal son is the younger son who says he wants his share of the inheritance. I know it's often debated whether the youngest son would actually inherit anything. So that would be a question of distributive justice. How are the benefits distributed throughout even any type of whole, whether it's the whole of society, the whole of the church, the whole of the family? Those are all issues of distributive justice. So these are the two parts we'll be looking into. Touched on this a little bit, but he breaks it down, Thomas breaks it down further and says distributive justice, he describes it as geometric. It's geometric, whereas his commutative justice, which is arithmetical. I'm always going to have trouble with the words in this one, arithmetical. And it kind of is a good image to imagine this. It kind of makes me laugh a little bit when I read it. So, distributive justice, when you think of the distribution of goods and burdens within a society, it is not given out one for one. No society that we know of, I think, has a one for one basis. It's not 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2 when we deal with distributive theories of justice. That would be really a perfectly equal society where everyone has the exact an arithmetical society. Everybody would have exactly one say in everything, one person, one vote. But that wouldn't include a republic in any way. It would just be everything would be voted one person, one vote for everything. You wouldn't have a president, you wouldn't have a Supreme Court, you wouldn't have a Congress, you would just have one person, one vote. If taxes were collected, it would be everyone would pay the exact same amount. If benefits were handed out, everyone would receive the exact same amount. Everything would be done equally. So if there was ever a war, everyone would be fighting in the war. We wouldn't be able to say, well, women stay home, men will fight, as we did maybe more in World War I and World War II, where women had more of a domestic role versus men had more of a international role when it came to the war. If society were run with distributive justice, arithmetically, everything would be perfectly even, perfectly equal. But it's probably not the society that we would want, and it's not the society that has ever existed, I think. This society that's our society with distributive theories of justice is proportional in some sense. And St. Aquinas, when he's writing this, he's talking about things that are done to a degree of proportion. So if you look at an aristocratic system, it should be gauged on virtue. So those with greater virtue have greater influence. Maybe you could picture something like Plato's Republic. Philosopher king is the head of it. Well, because why is the philosopher king the head of it? Because the philosopher king has the greatest virtue. So the person with the greatest virtue should have the greatest influence over leadership. Um, Similarly, people who have certain talents in certain areas should be in those areas, not perfectly equally, but everybody should be doing what they're good at. A diversified system is kind of aristocratic system he talks about. The oligarchy would be a system that's based on wealth. So those with the greatest amount of money have the greatest amount of power, the greatest amount of influence. Arguably, the United States has something maybe more similar to this, since most of our elected representatives are also uh, very rich before they got elected. So, sense that if you have more money, you have more influence. And democracy uh, is based on liberty, but he doesn't go into any more detail on this. So it's a little bit difficult to flush that one out more because he doesn't really go into this more. And as I pointed out, if you did arithmetically the commutative justice, everything is perfectly equal, but he says that that's really not how our society works. And just to break it down, just a hair more, with our current distributive theory of justice, um, if you are wealthier, you end up paying more. If you had a 20% tax, well, everyone doesn't pay the same. It's not perfectly equal because if you make $1 million, 20% of $1 million is a lot more than 20% of somebody who makes $30,000. So it's proportional. It's not arithmetic. It's not perfect math in that regard, and it's not addition and subtraction. It's multiplication. Um, and also those who receive, those who have the least receive, in theory, the most, not those who are those in the middle or those who are the wealthiest because they don't need it. So that's somewhat of the rationale of distributive theories of justice for them to be the most effective, to have the greatest amount of equity. In some sense, has to be unequal in order to get the services to where they're needed and to have it paid for by those who are the most able to pay for it. Kind of already you've been jumping ahead, but as he points out, this is Thomas Aquinas' example in the second article, 61. If we say 6 is to 4 as 3 is to 2, we could say, we could simplify that, right? If we simplify that, we're really saying the exact same thing. 6/4 and 3 seconds is exactly the same as 1.5. So they're the same, but that's only geometrically the same because if we look at it arithmetically, 6 is higher than 3. 6 is higher than 4. 6 is greater than 3. Therefore, it is not the same. It is not the same if you look at it through the lens of arithmetic. So, as you point out, people get according to their state of life where they are not completely equal. If you say again, if people pay 20% tax, well, 20% will be different, depends on the amount of money that you make. Or if you talk about benefits that people get, it depends upon their degree of poverty, not everyone receiving the same thing. If everyone received welfare, it wouldn't make no sense because not everyone needs welfare. So he then breaks down the question of matter as a form of justice, and to understand what he's talking. What is the matter of justice? If I have a little pencil here, if I say what is the matter of the pencil, you could say, well, it's graphite and it's a wood. But what is the matter of justice? Something that seems to be intangible, and he describes it as the external operations So when we look at what are the external operations of justice, well, he says, well, we'll break these down further. This is just a summary page, but uh, the two forms of operations, they both contain distribution, and I think it's probably just easier to jump into the parts. So if we look at the operations of distributive justice, there can be distribution from the common property. When you talk about distribution, there is a distribution. So if somebody is receiving Social Security payments from the whole, right? People paid into it their whole life, but they receive from the whole um, common property of Social Security. That is a distribution, a literal distribution of capital. But then there's also a distribution on an individual level, on a commutative level. There's also still distribution, even though it's not the distributive theory. There is distribution within the commutative act. So if I work for Walmart and I put in 40 hours a week or however many hours, I am owed a distribution of money as well. And even though this is between two individuals, I am an individual and I work for another individual. I say Walmart, but you could say anything. Let's say I'm working for my neighbor to cut my neighbor's lawn. If I cut my neighbor's lawn and we agreed that they will pay me, then I should be distributed a certain amount of income. So in some sense, he's differentiating this by saying, um, don't you can say, well, there's no difference between distributive and commutative, and he's saying, no, there is a difference. There is distributive theory is clearly distributive, as in this first example from the common property, but there is a distributive nature also with the commutative acts. So the external operations exist both in both, but as he points out, there is also parts of the commutative operations which is not distributive. So all distributive justice is distributive, but not all commutative justice is distributive. Some parts of commutative justice is distributed, and some of it is not distributed. So he then breaks down justice from voluntary and involuntary operations. So again, we're still under the topic of matter, and the matter is really talking about external operations. So if somebody commutes your chattel, which is your property, your physical property, if they do it secretly, then it is called theft, and if they do it openly, it's called robbery. If somebody commutes your person, then they kill you secretly or strike you or poison you secretly. Or openly, they can also kill you. They could imprison you, they could hit you, they could maim you. These are terms that Aquinas used, so I'm repeating his examples. Against the personal dignity of another, one can secretly commute one's dignity, can steal one's dignity secretly through gossiping about people behind their back, or if you work for somebody to talk badly about your employer or your priest or your politician to speak about them badly behind their back, or openly, people can openly within a court of law false witness you, perjury, or they can publicly insult you. So that can also be done publicly or privately. And then against personal relationships, one could commute you by secretly trying to steal your wife, steal your husband, or they say seduce your slave. And openly they can do the exact same thing. And I did touch on slavery before, and I should probably link to the slavery issue. But in short, again, I don't want Aquinas or Aristotle, who he's using for this, to be misconstrued. Again, slavery, according to Aristotle and Aquinas, is only allowed, only ethically allowed, when it is mutually beneficial for both parties. So only if they don't believe in ethnic or racial slavery, and they only believe it is ethical and it should be allowed within a city if it is mutually beneficial, that the person who loses their freedom as a slave is better off. Their lives is better off than if they had their freedom, which is a pretty high bar to make your life better without freedom. And then the person who is the slave owner is better off by having that person as a slave. So only when it is mutually beneficial. And an example I think you could point to something like this would be maybe if the person had maybe drug or alcohol or mental health problems, developmental problems of some kind, declined ability to make rational decisions for themselves. So within our own society, we see people who end up living in the hedges at the off ramp of a highway. We could look at that and say their freedom isn't really helping them flourish. If there was some system which there was some way in which they could lose some of their freedom, but it was putting them on the right path, providing them with housing and food and clothing and the ability to have a more meaningful work. If it was mutually beneficial, then that could be something which we wouldn't call slavery today, but could be in that way. So if you were to try to, back to this example, if somebody were to say to your slave, you'd be so much better off if you weren't here, get out of here. And you would say, well, wasn't that good? Trying to convince somebody not to be a slave, isn't that Harriet Tubman? That's not, it's hard but it's not in that context. It would be more like if you were to go up to somebody who's in a rehab center and 1 week into rehab, and maybe they need a month or something like that. But 1 week into rehab, you convince them you don't need these people. Sneak out of rehab. Um, in that way, you have created an injustice by seducing somebody away from the thing that they need to survive, the thing that is benefiting them. And it's an injustice to the person who's now going to not get the rehab that they needed. It's also an injustice to the rehab center who has dedicated time and energy and given a bed to this person to get better. And if the person leaves after a week, it was a complete waste of time. And that could have been used for somebody else who would have actually stayed for the whole program. So in that way, he's talking about seducing the slave. Probably if I were trying to do a 30-second video on this topic, I wouldn't even bring it up. But I'm figuring anybody who's watching these videos is more of a serious student, and they're going to be more interested in these finer details of this issue. And if you're not, then I apologize. These might not be the videos for you. When we look at, those were involuntary commutations of a person's property, a person's dignity, a person's person. Now there are also voluntary commutations. This is also another operation of commutations. And this is through commerce, bailment, and deposit. I probably even could have put number 1, 2, and 3. But commerce is just quid pro quo. If I pay you money to buy a book, you give me the book and I give you the money. Just perfect exchange. So there is an even exchange of under this type of voluntary commutation. If you recall, involuntary commutation, somebody steals the book, they have done it against your will. They have taken your chattel and you've gotten nothing from it. That was involuntarily, they have taken from you. This is voluntary, so it is freely given. Bailment is another example. He doesn't use the word bailment, obviously it's an English word, but it's what he described as essentially the legal term of bailment, where you have voluntarily handed over your property to another for their use, with the idea that it would be returned. So it is a loan for the benefit of the person you've given this bailment to. And there's two types of these bailments, according to St. Thomas, and you have to, again, forgive my pronunciation, but it's coming from the Latin. But usufruct, which is a fruitful bailment. So, if, as an example, and Thomas doesn't give an example, but I'm going to try to make one up. If you had a female horse and I had a male horse, and I were to lend you my male horse in order to breed your female horse, I have lent you something for you to use, and it has produced um, uh, an offspring. So you have had some real material benefit from this. It has been a fruitful bailment. So that's a commutation. It's a good commutation. You lent a horse and you got something from it. The other one is unfruitful, he said, and in his example is money and pottery. Although today I think if probably even then, if you were to lend money, the idea is that it would at least produce interest on a loan. But this would be something that if you hand it to the person and they give it back, nothing has ultimately changed. The idea, you give your friend $30 and they give you back $30. Um, he would call that unfruitful. Again, it's just really borrowing. I lend you my hammer and you give me back my hammer. And the last one is deposit, which we talk about from time to time as well, which is if you give somebody, I give you my sword to hold on to because I need you to hold it. Not again, bailment was for your benefit, not my benefit, right? I give you this for your benefit, not my benefit. Um, Deposit, I give you my sword for my benefit, not your benefit. So I ask you to hold on to this maybe because I don't have a safe place to keep it, or I'm going to go away for a while and I don't want somebody to break into my house and steal my valuable sword. So I give it to you. You have a nice secure place to put it. And you probably gave me a piece of paper that said, I owe Dr. Thibault one sword, described it. And I go back with the piece of paper, and you give me the sword, and I give you the paper back. And I might probably paid you for your services for holding my deposit. So that's another one where I voluntarily give you my sword for my own benefit. Uh, that is a equal operation. So this are all under the form of justice. How is this justice? Well, if you work, you should get paid, right? If I sell you something, I should get paid, and you should get the thing you bought. If I lend you something, that you should give it back to me. That's just, right? That's equal. Uh, and if I hire you to hold something for me when I go to get it back, you give it back to me. So these are equal. This is justice. Voluntary commutations of justice. This is one of the operations of justice. Um, the next question was: is justice always retaliation? And for this one, you really have to define retaliation because it's probably not we don't have really an English word for it perfectly. So retaliation in the Latin is contrapassum, which is equal passion repaid for previous actions. Again, back to the Latin quid pro quo, that there's an equal exchange for previous actions. Now, there's different types of actions, as you can imagine. So, the good actions, as we kind of just discussed, like if I work, you pay me. Well, that's an equal action. That's commutative, right? That was an equal action. If I lend you something, you give it back to me. If I lend you something for my own benefit, you give it back to me when I ask for it back. So these are all repayments for a previous action, working or giving you something. Those would be equal. Not escalated. It's perfectly arithmetical, right? I give you one, you give me one, right? It's an even exchange. It's perfectly equal in that regard. And then he talks about it in the kind of the negative way as well in these first two. The third one here, voluntary. This is, as we discussed perfectly within the previous slide, so we don't need to cover number 3 again. But number 1 is, what if a person injures you? So equal passion repaid for previous action, right? That's what retaliation is. So if a person punches you in the face, well, what would be what would be the equal and opposite reaction? Uh, well, if somebody punches you in the face, they get punched in the face. So that would be an equal reaction. Um, he does point out that if you punch a prince and you're a commoner, it might be an even greater reaction than just in one for one, depending on who you are. But an eye for an eye is the model of that. Also, in terms of if somebody were to steal your property, right? These are the involuntary, these first two are the involuntary forms of commutative operations. Um, somebody were to steal your property, then there's this equal reaction. But as he points out from biblical text in Exodus, if somebody takes one of your sheep, you take 4 of their sheep. If somebody kills one of your cattle, you take 5 of their cattle. So it's not exactly an equal. It's not always equal, but there is a reparation. There is a retaliation uh, in regards to the taking. If I am going to suffer a loss, you are going to suffer a loss. So those are again, number 1 and 2 are involuntary um, forms of operations, and then the third one is voluntary uh, uh, form. So there is retaliation in commutative justice. Um, He does then point out that there's no retaliation for distributive justice. And the reason really is because of the math. It's geometric rather than arithmetic, right? So it's not equal. So commutative justice is supposed to be one for one. It's equal, right? I've been saying this for a half hour now. Commutative justice is equal. So if you take my car, I get my car back. If you steal $100, I get my $100 back. If you punch me, I punch you. Right? It's one for one. Really, that's the aim of arithmetic. Um, 1 + 1 = 2. Uh, but this idea of distributive justice isn't about one for one. So it's not, you can't have a equal repay. So I was thinking about this in terms of something like Social Security or any type of public program where we're paying money into a public system of some kind. It's never one for one. It would be a miracle if somebody got in exactly to the penny the same amount that they put into the system. This is not really how the system is designed to be that way. There's no checks and balances. There's no ideal sense that that should be how it works. Everything you pay into Social Security, you get back to the penny. You should have just had a savings account, right? Social Security is not intended to be a savings account. If everything you put in that you took out in food stamps you had paid in to the penny, then there would be no need for food stamps in some ways. Same thing with unemployment insurance, right? You very seldom take out exactly the same amount as you put in. These public systems aren't intended to be one for one. They are intended to create a pool of resources which then are utilized based on the needs of the individuals, and very seldom or very often the people who pay the most into it will not be the ones who take the most out of it. That just happens to be how distributive theory of justice works. If your goal of distributive theory of justice is really just one for one, then I think the person will be very frustrated because it will almost never occur in that way. And it's also, according to St. Thomas in his view of this, it's not intended to be that way, right? The rich are intended to help the poor, not that the poor are helping themselves equally in the same way monetarily. So he said distributive justice is not retaliation, and by that what he means is equally equally repay for previous actions. That's not how it's intended. As a conclusion, the parts of justice are commutative and distributive. The commutative justice is based on retribution, retributive, and arithmetical math when trying to calculate what is due to them. Distributive justice is not a one-for-one. It's aimed at being proportional and geometrical. And they have different operations because they have different functions within society. So I hope that is helpful. And next time we will move forward to some subjective forms of justice. Have a good week.